This is the Bible Book Club. I'm Susan.
And I'm Heather.
And we're in the book of 2 Samuel.
Welcome to the club. In chapters 16 through 18, David was forced to flee Jerusalem, and he met people on the road who showed their loyalty or their disdain. In chapter 16, he meets Ziba, who brought provisions for the men. Ziba was Mephibosheth's servant. Then he met Shimei, who cursed him. Shimei was a Benjaminite and a Saul supporter. Meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, Absalom's advisor Ahithophel advised him to sleep with David's 10 concubines. Then Absalom was tricked into taking bad advice from Hushai, David's spy, which gave David and his men time to cross over the Jordan. When Ahithophel heard that Absalom took Hushai's advice over his, he committed suicide. Then a battle began. Absalom pursued David across the Jordan. David then rallied the troops and sent them off, but not before begging them to be gentle with his son Absalom. David's troops routed Absalom's, and Absalom got caught by his hair in a tree, and Joab killed him.
Oh, I know, really sad. This is a lot. Scene 1, David's heart is torn. This is chapter 18 continued, so we're in the same story.
Verse 19. Now, Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, said, "Let me run and take the news to the king that the Lord has vindicated him by delivering him from the hand of his enemies." "You are not the one to take the news today," Joab told him. "You may take the news another time, but you must not do so today because the king's son is dead." Then Joab said to a Cushite, "Go, tell the king what you've seen." The Cushite bowed down before Joab and ran off. Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, again said to Joab, "Come what may, please let me run behind the Cushite." But Joab replied, "My son, why do you want to go? You don't have any news that will bring you a reward." He said, "Come what may, I want to run." So Joab said, "Run." Then Ahimaaz ran by way of the plain and outran the Cushite.
So Ahimaaz really wants to bring the news of victory to David because, think about it, he and Jonathan had been part of the spy network. They had hidden in the well and successfully warned David to escape across the Jordan, and they had won. Of course, Jonathan was excited about the victory, and he wanted to bring the good news to the king. But Joab refuses to send him, and perhaps he had a good reason. Joab was probably thinking about Absalom's death and what David might do to the bearer of such bad news. Recall what happened in 2 Samuel 1, episode 1, when the Amalekite brought David the news of Saul's death. David killed him. Of course, David killed him because the Amalekite claimed to have killed Saul, and Saul was God's anointed. Now, Absalom had not been anointed, but he was David's son. And Ahimaaz did not kill him, but still he would be bringing the bad news. So Joab isn't taking any chances and wants to send a Cushite. The Cushites were foreigners. They were descendants from Noah's son Ham. Recall that the Israelites were descendants of Noah's son Seth.
And is the reason he wants to send a Cushite is because David might get mad and kill the messenger?
Yeah, and Joab would rather he kill a Cushite than an Israelite.
Right. Yeah.
He's protecting his own.
Mm-hmm. Continuing then in verse 24. While David was sitting between the inner and outer gates, the watchman went up to the roof of the gateway by the wall. As he looked out, he saw a man running alone, and the watchman called out to the king and reported it. The king said, "If he's alone, he must have good news." And the runner came closer and closer. Then the watchman saw another runner, and he called out to the gatekeeper, "Look, another man running alone." The king said, "He must be bringing good news too." The watchman said, "It seems to me that the first one runs like Ahimaaz, son of Zadok." "He's a good man," the king said. "He comes with good news." Then Ahimaaz called out to the king, "All is well." He bowed down before the king with his face to the ground and said, "Praise be to the Lord your God. He has delivered up those who lifted their hands against my lord the king." And the king asked, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" Ahimaaz answered, "I saw great confusion just as Joab was about to send the king's servant and me, your servant, but I don't know what it was." The king said, "Stand aside and wait here." So he stepped aside and stood there.
So this is a little confusing because Joab specifically said to Ahimaaz, you may not take the news this time because the king's son is dead. However, Ahimaaz was really excited, and maybe he was confused. He wasn't really listening. You just know how those young, excited people are. They just want to go and do what they want to do. So Ahimaaz seems to have seen a disturbance, he says, going on before he left, but he doesn't really know. Therefore, we can assume from what he said, unless we think he was lying, of course, that he is unaware of Absalom's death, and David is more anxious for news of his son than of his army's victory, and he brushes Ahimaaz aside.
Don't you think that if you're on your way to tell the king something, you're going to get your ducks in a row and know what you're talking about?
Yeah, but adrenaline's going. They just want to battle. They've been avoiding death all this time. I don't know. People get fired up and they don't pay attention to the details. Otherwise, I don't know why he'd be so excited to go tell the king that they won, knowing that the king had specifically told them, "Be gentle with my son."
Right.
So I do think he's kind of just oblivious.
Verse 31. Then the Cushite arrived and said, "My lord the king, hear the good news. The Lord has vindicated you today by delivering you from the hand of all who rose up against you." The king asked the Cushite, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" The Cushite replied, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up to harm you be like that young man." Well, the king was shaken. He went up to the room over the gateway and wept. As he went, he said, "Oh, my son, Absalom, my son, Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son."
So we kind of have to really picture David in this. He has seen a lot of death, and a lot of death in his own family, from his infant son, he and Bathsheba's son, to Amnon, and now Absalom. And if we know David and his character, and this king has such a big heart, and you can see he is just bereft. With this death, David's story kind of comes full circle, because David began in 2 Samuel mourning the death of Saul, a man he loved, a man who was trying to kill him, a man he had to take the kingdom from. And now David is back where he started, mourning the death of Absalom, a man he loved, a man who had been trying to kill him, and a man he had to take the kingdom away from. Being king was painful. And at this point, David is older, and he says he would rather die himself than experience this pain for his son. His grief was made all the more painful because of his deep conviction that it was his sin with Bathsheba and Uriah that brought about Absalom's rebellion. David's heart is broken because he knows at the beginning of all this, the genesis of this was he broke the Lord's heart by sinning. His pain consumes him, and his despondency has become public knowledge. In scene 2, Joab rebukes David.
Continuing in 2 Samuel chapter 19, Joab was told the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom. And for the whole army, the victory that day was turned into mourning because on that day, the troops heard it said the king is grieving for his son. The men stole into the city that day as men steal in who are ashamed when they flee from battle. The king covered his face and cried aloud, "Oh, my son Absalom! Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." Then Joab went into the house of the king and said, "Today you have humiliated all your men who have just saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters and the lives of your wives and concubines. You love those who hate you and hate those who love you. You have made it clear today that the commanders and their men mean nothing to you. I see that you would be pleased if Absalom were alive today and all of us were dead. Now, go out and encourage your men. I swear by the Lord that if you don't go out, not a man will be left with you by nightfall. This will be worse for you than all the calamities that have come on you from your youth until now." So the king got up and took his seat in the gateway. When the men were told the king is sitting in the gateway, they all came before him.
So this is such a conflicting scene because on the one hand, you have to feel good that David really mourns his son, and he should. This is his son. On the other hand, he has been given this anointed position as a leader, and he needs to act like a leader.
And Joab's right. He is kind of disrespecting and disregarding what all these men have just done for him.
Exactly. Joab is a mixed bag. So let's just talk about Joab a little bit. He's the sometimes good, sometimes bad guy that David cannot get rid of. Remember, they're related, and David loves his family. Joab is actually David's nephew. Now, Joab does not have David's heart for the Lord, but he does have a gift for being pragmatic. He is not afraid to call it like it is, and even to the king, which is great. Joab never loses sight of what Israel needs to do to be victorious. However, his methods are often not up to God's standard. In this story, Joab plays the good guy by making a very valid point. David is grieving over Absalom, the man who opposed God. Because remember, Absalom rebelled against God's anointed man, David, while he's ignoring the men who risked their lives for God. David's loyalty should be to his God and his anointed position over God's people. As king, David must put his personal grief aside. Okay, scene 3. The Israelites are confused.
Meanwhile, the Israelites had fled to their homes. Throughout the tribes of Israel, all the people were arguing among themselves, saying, "The king delivered us from the hand of our enemies. He is the one who rescued us from the hand of the Philistines. But now he has fled the country to escape from Absalom. And Absalom, whom we anointed to rule over us, has died in battle. So why do you say nothing about bringing the king back?"
Okay. So the Israelites had anointed Absalom to rule, but he was dead. And when we say the Israelites, it was half the tribe of Judah, part of the tribe of Judah that wasn't loyal to David, and the rest of the tribes. So they had gone to Team Absalom. David is now in exile with his men, just those who are loyal to him. He's out across the Jordan. The question the tribal leaders were all asking is, okay, who should be king now? We're like at ground zero again. So do we go back to David, or is there someone else? Now, then they start talking about David still has the best resume as the one who rescued them from the Philistines. So it's almost like they were going through, okay, who could be king? Who could be king? Well, David still looks the best. The tribes flat out are confused, and they're waiting on Judah. The tribe of Judah was the leading tribe and David's tribe. So they're wondering why Judah has not brought David back, because he's clearly their best leader. But Judah's in a bit of a fix. They had led the rebellion against David. So it was risky for them to take David back, because in those days, what did kings do to those people who rebelled against them? They killed them. So David kind of hears this through the grapevine that, everybody's waffling. They don't know what to do about bringing him back. And he steps in with an olive branch to assuage their fears.
Can I ask you to go back and explain what it meant that David was going to sit in the gateway? Because Joab tells him, hey, look, you're disrespecting the men. You need to go out there and give them some encouragement. So I thought that he was maybe going out to the gateway to give some speech, but then he doesn't.
No. So remember when Boaz went to the city gates? So the elders often sat at the gates to take people's problems or whatever. It meant like they're present to be leaders, I guess, is the way of looking at it.
So he basically was just like going to get back to work without going out to encourage them like Joab had told him to.
Well, by sitting at the gates, he's saying, I'm here to help, I think.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I'm not like crying in my tent hiding. I'm here. I'm out in front of the men. Thank you for, he probably did give them.
Okay. But yet they're still confused.
Well, those were his men who got to see him at the gate. It probably wasn't the gate of Jerusalem, because they're still across the Jordan, you'll see. So he went out to sit at like the gate of the camp probably. And that's for his men. But back across the Jordan, we've got Judah and the rest of Israel debating, okay, what do we do now? Okay. Who's in charge?
Who's going to be the next king? And that's where we find ourselves in verse 11. King David sent this message to Zadok and Abiathar, the priests. Ask the elders of Judah, why should you be the last to bring the king back to his palace, since what is being said throughout Israel has reached the king at his quarters? You are my relatives, my own flesh and blood. So why should you be the last to bring back the king? And say to Amasa, are you not my own flesh and blood? May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if you are not the commander of the army for life in place of Joab. He won over the hearts of the men of Judah so that they were all of one mind. They sent word to the king, "Return you and all of your men." Then the king returned and went as far as the Jordan.
So as I said, Judah is noticeably slow in pledging allegiance to David. So David sends a message to the elders of Judah, offering to make Amasa, the leader of their rebellious army, his own leader in place of Joab. This would assure them that he did not mean to kill them for their part in the rebellion. Now, one has to wonder how Joab felt about the demotion. David is definitely lending credence to Joab's accusation to him that he loves those who hate him and hates those who love him. For David is showing love to Amasa, who hates him, and hate to Joab, who loves him. But David had justification for disliking Joab. Joab had killed Abner against David's will. Joab had killed Absalom against David's will. Joab had demonstrated loyalty to David, but not obedience to David. Joab did what Joab thought was right, and Joab is not going to be happy about Amasa. Scene 4, on the road to return. In David's exodus from Jerusalem, he was confronted by people who had to choose between allegiance to the crown or rebellion against it. Our author flips the story here, and on David's return to Jerusalem, he's going to meet some of these same people once again. This time, they're all going to vow their allegiance to him, starting with Ziba and Shimei.
Continuing in verse 15. Now the men of Judah had come to Gilgal to go out and meet the king and bring him across the Jordan. Shimei, son of Gera, the Benjamite from Bahurim, hurried down with the men of Judah to meet King David. With him were 1,000 Benjamites, along with Ziba, the steward of Saul's household, and his 15 sons and 20 servants. They rushed to the Jordan, where the king was. They crossed at the ford to take the king's household over and to do whatever he wished. When Shimei, son of Gera, crossed the Jordan, he fell prostrate before the king and said to him, "May the Lord not hold me guilty. Do not remember how your servant did wrong on the day the Lord King left Jerusalem. May the king put it out of his mind, for I, your servant, know that I have sinned. But today I have come here as the first from the tribes of Joseph to come down and meet my lord the king." Then Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said, "Shouldn't Shimei be put to death for this? He cursed the Lord's anointed." David replied, "What does this have to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? What right do you have to interfere? Should anyone be put to death in Israel today? Don't I know that today I am king over Israel?" So the king said to Shimei, "You shall not die." And the king promised him on oath.
Okay, I love the scene because David really never gets annoyed. Moses got annoyed a lot, I feel like. But here we just see a little hint of David's annoyance. So first, Zibi, the servant of Mephibosheth, who brought David supplies on his flight from Jerusalem, greets him and takes care of his household again. So Zibi is again showing his allegiance. Then we have Shimei, the one who cursed David as he fled Jerusalem in chapter 16, meets him with a totally different attitude. The focus, however, is less on Shimei and more on Joab's brother Abishai. In fact, the conversation in this chapter is almost exactly the same as the conversation that happened in chapter 16 when David was leaving Jerusalem. Listen to what he said to Abishai then.
Then Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said to the king, "Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and cut off his head." But the king said, "What does this have to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? If he is cursing because the Lord said to him, 'Curse David,' who can ask, 'Why do you do this?'"
So Abishai wanted to kill Shimei on the way out of Jerusalem, and now he wants to kill him on the way back. David responds to Abishai both times that it is none of his business. And both times David calls Abishai, "You sons of Zeruiah." He uses the plural for sons, like Abishai could be two people. What he's really saying here is this: recall that the sons of Zeruiah are Joab, Abishai, and Asael. Asael was killed in chapter 2. That leaves the two brothers, Joab and Abishai, currently serving David in the army. Two men who do not hesitate to shed blood. Joab killed Abner and Absalom, and Abishai is eager to kill Shimei. David here, by saying, "You sons of Zeruiah," may be sending a subtle warning that he has grown very weary of the sons of Zeruiah's killer ways despite their fierce loyalty to him. Is he going to tolerate any longer? We will find out. Next, on the road back to Jerusalem, David meets Mephibosheth. Recall that during David's flight from Jerusalem, Ziba had told David that Mephibosheth didn't go with him because he was staying in the city because he hoped to be made king as Saul's grandson. I didn't buy a word of that, by the way. That just doesn't sound like him. But in other words, Ziba was saying that Mephibosheth was not loyal to David.
Verse 24, Mephibosheth, Saul's grandson, also went down to meet the king. He had not taken care of his feet or trimmed his mustache or washed his clothes from the day the king left until the day he returned safely. When he came from Jerusalem to meet the king asked him, "Why didn't you go with me, Mephibosheth?" He said, "My lord the king, since I, your servant, am lame, I said, I will have my donkey saddled and I will ride on it so I can go with the king. But Ziba, my servant, betrayed me, and he has slandered your servant to my lord the king. My lord the king is like an angel of God. So do whatever you wish. All my grandfather's descendants deserve nothing but death from my lord the king. But you gave your servant a place among those who eat at your table. So what right do I have to make any more appeals to the king?" The king said to him, "Why say more? I order you and Ziba to divide the land." Mephibosheth said to the king, "Let him take everything, now that my lord the king has returned home safely."
I almost kind of feel like David was tired by this point. He's tired of the people, the arguing. And he kind of just, when Mephibosheth approached David with the appearance of one who has been in mourning, it looks like he felt bad about the whole thing. And he even insists that he is loyal and that Ziba betrayed him. But David is just unable to ascertain the truth. So because Ziba's been so loyal, bringing him all these provisions. So he tells them just divide the land, and moves on to where he next meets the last person on the road back to Jerusalem, Barzillai. Now, Barzillai had provided food and bedding for David and his army on the way out once he had crossed the Jordan.
Verse 31, Barzillai, the Gileadite, also came down from Rogalim to cross the Jordan with the king and to send him on his way from there. Now, Barzillai was very old, 80 years of age. He had provided for the king during his stay at Mahanaim, for he was a very wealthy man. The king said to Barzillai, "Cross over with me and stay with me in Jerusalem, and I will provide for you." But Barzillai answered the king, "How many more years will I live that I should go up to Jerusalem with the king? I am now 80 years old. Can I tell the difference between what is enjoyable and what is not? Can your servant taste what he eats and drinks? Can I still hear the voices of the male and the female singers? Why should your servant be an added burden to the Lord my king? Your servant will cross over the Jordan with the king for a short distance. But why should the king reward me in this way? Let your servant return that I may die in my own town near the tomb of my father and mother. But here is your servant Kimham. Let him cross over with the Lord your king. Do for him whatever you wish." The king said, "Kimham shall cross over with me, and I will do for him whatever you wish. And anything you desire from me, I will do for you." So all the people crossed the Jordan, and then the king crossed over. The king kissed Barzillai and bid him farewell, and Barzillai returned to his home.
Barzillai is the most favorite of the commentaries of all the people he meets on the road because he's this example of a wise, content man of faith who knows his place. He knows what he believes, and he does not waver when trouble descends. He rushes in to help. He acts on his faith, and his faith does not fail him. He doesn't waver. He doesn't change his mind. In the end, he doesn't even need a reward. God has rewarded him enough. He has his place in the promised land, and it is going to be there that he will die. He doesn't need to go to the palace and have all these glamorous things. So, all right, that's everybody. Scene 5, the crossover conflict. It is time for David to cross back over the Jordan River. Now, the Jordan has always been a big deal. Think back to Joshua's crossing over the river. And all of Judah is with David, along with some of the troops of the rest of Israel. So David has won this big battle. He's the king again. Everyone has gathered around him, and it's time to bring him marching back to the palace. Now, recall also that processions of tribes and the order in which they were commanded to march was also a big deal in the Bible, dating back to Numbers 10. And that first march out of Sinai as a nation into the wilderness with Moses. In those marches, Judah always marched first when they moved the tabernacle, and then the 11 tribes had a very specific order that they all fell in around, with the tabernacle and the Levites being in the middle. So marching's a big deal, crossing over the Jordan's a big deal, and it's no surprise that trouble arises amongst the tribes over who's going to march where in this celebration march. It was a thing, and they were jealous.
But if they all know where they're supposed to be, why should...
This is a different thing. So this is not the tabernacle. It's just that's how they got that pride in where you march, is because way back then it was a thing. And here, once again, Judah's still the lead tribe. So of course, they're going to have a little fit when... Why does Judah get to have the king? Why does Judah get to go first? We are also, I'm going to give away the next part.
Verse 40, when the king crossed over to Gilgal, Kimham crossed with him. All the troops of Judah and half the troops of Israel had taken the king over. Soon all the men of Israel were coming to the king and saying to him, "Why did our brothers, the men of Judah, steal the king away and bring him and his household across the Jordan together with all his men?" All the men of Judah answered the men of Israel, "We did this because the king is closely related to us. Why are you angry about it? Have we eaten any of the king's provisions? Have we taken anything for ourselves?" Then the men of Israel answered the men of Judah, "We have 10 shares in the king, so we have a greater claim on David than you have. Why then do you treat us with contempt? Weren't we the first to speak of bringing back our king?" But the men of Judah pressed their claims even more forcefully than the men of Israel.
So David goes ahead and crosses the Jordan, escorted by the troops of Judah and half the tribes of Israel. So it was a celebratory parade in which Judah was given the position of distinction near David. The other tribes complain that it's not fair. The tribes of Israel say that they have 10 shares in the king and therefore a greater claim on him. Now, the men of Israel counted themselves as 10 tribes. That's why they're saying 10 shares. But there were 12 tribes total. So the tribe of Judah plus 10 tribes would be only 11 tribes. So the 10 shares could have meant one of two things. They were counting Manasseh and Ephraim, the two tribes of Joseph, as one tribe, or the tribe of Simeon had been absorbed into Judah and was a tribe no more. If you want to know about that, why that, you got to go way back to Genesis and start over. Either way, the nation is cracking and threatens to divide the tribes of Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Nathan's prophecy casts a long, dark shadow into the future. The scepter will never depart from David's line, but it will be red with discord going forward. So in another few chapters, there's going to be a census, and we're gonna, a long time ago, like in Numbers, they counted just the number of fighting men in each tribe. And David's going to take another census, and you're going to see Judah has just gotten bigger. Remember how some tribes had grown and some had shrunk? And you could definitely see there were some tribes that Judah was the strongest tribe and the biggest, even way back when they marched out of Sinai. And now it's grown even bigger. So Judah in the south is going to become a kingdom, and all the other tribes in the north.
Wasn't there a time too at which the tribe of Dan went away? They were no longer part.
Yeah, that's going to happen way in the future, because they never really claimed their promised land. They went up into the mountains, and they were really wishy-washy about kicking people out, and we covered that already.
Yeah. So didn't that already happen? So that could be why there's talking about 11 tribes.
No, because Dan still has a presence.
Oh, they are still there now.
Yeah, they're still a tribe. Simeon's the one that's getting swallowed up by Judah. Because remember, Simeon sinned and he was no more. He was going to be dispersed like the Levites. The Levites, it became a blessing, and Simeon kind of lost its identity.
Yeah.
All right, scene 6. Another troublemaker tries to take over.
Chapter 20. Now, a troublemaker named Sheba, son of Bichri the Benjamite, happened to be there. He sounded the trumpet and shouted, "We have no share in David, no part in Jesse's son. Every man to his tent, Israel." So all the men of Israel deserted David to follow Sheba, son of Bichri. But the men of Judah stayed by their king all the way from the Jordan to Jerusalem.
Sheba's a Benjaminite from the tribe of Saul, and he thinks, gosh, if Absalom can split his own tribe, why can't I rally all the other tribes against Judah? And what better time than now when all of Israel is put out because Judah gets all the attention and honor. So Sheba rallies Israel against Judah. But before our author gives the details on Sheba's rebellion, he provides a little bit of closure for 10 casualties of Absalom's rebellion. Scene 7. This is kind of an insertion into the Sheba rebellion story. David provides for the 10 concubines.
Verse 3. When David returned to his palace in Jerusalem, he took the 10 concubines he had left to take care of the palace and put them in a house under guard. He provided for them, but had no sexual relations with them. They were kept in confinement until the day of their death, living as widows.
The victims of Absalom's rebellion were not just men killed in battle. There were 10 women who were publicly sexually assaulted by Absalom. Now, these women were David's concubines. Concubines were women acquired as secondary wives. I'm going to put wives in quotes there. A concubine did not have the rights of a wife, and her children were not rightful heirs. Though a wife might offer a servant to her husband as a concubine to have children on her behalf, as happened in Genesis with the wives of Abraham and Jacob. Concubines were more than mistresses, but less than wives. They lived in a world in between, recognized as part of the family, but a second family. Now, the Bible does not call David's collection of women a harem, but many commentaries do, because what other word can you give it but that? These poor 10 women were part of David's harem, a harem he never should have had to begin with. And they were left behind to care for the palace when David fled Jerusalem. Now, it's not clear whether Absalom took them by force or they consented, but David provides for them, so we can assume it was by force. David then consigns them to widowhood. In other words, they were no longer publicly recognized as part of the harem or wives, quotes again. The commentaries take very different stances on how terrible this fate was for these women. Some comment that this was a lifelong imprisonment, which was harsh, for they were innocent casualties of war and politics. Some commentaries interpret this sentence as a confinement to a sequestered life that was more stringent than normal harem life, but not a heavy sentence. Remember, as part of David's royal women, they were already somewhat sequestered. Many women shared this one man, David, so it's not like they got much, if any, attention from him anyway. The difference probably would have been that they could no longer attend palace functions as a member of the royal family. Some also say that this widowhood may have only lasted until David's death, and then they would have been freed, but not many said that. David's reign took place during a time when women did not have much freedom. In the Old Testament, the status of women varied. While they were not universally considered property, in certain circles, their marriages or alliances were contractual arrangements. In this case, Absalom had made the concubines impure, and they were no longer appropriate wives for the king. Now, in the next episode, the jealous Joab, the incompetent commander Amasa, and the troublemaker Sheba all take center stage together, but only one will be standing when the scene ends.
I feel like this is a really confusing part of the story because the Israelites were all confused. They weren't sure who was supposed to be king. And then next thing you know, they're marching David across the Jordan as if he's king. There's like a lot of unrest, a civil war going on. What's happening here?
So this is part of the sin in David's fall. It's just getting worse. It's ramping up. So yes, he gets over the Absalom rebellion, loses his son, and before he even gets all the way, gets over across the Jordan, and another guy causes a rebellion. And this is, again, that churning that's beginning in the heart of this nation. And that churning started with, hey, we had all this hope for this great king finally, this man after God's own heart, but he's a sinner. He's not Jesus. And while he has a great start, and we had about 9 chapters of him only getting better and better, then he makes this mistake. And now we see just the consequences of that. And it's, if you think this one's bad, just wait till we get to 1 Kings.
What's a club without friends? If you're enjoying the Bible Book Club, why don't you share it? And then you can say, Welcome to the club. New episodes drop every Monday, and get all episodes now on Amazon Music. As always, head over to susanme.com/Bible Book Club for show notes from today's episode. Bible Book Club is hosted by Susan Merrill and Heather Rubio, edited by Buck Buchanan, produced by Haley Mawat.